My stuff is. Hello, everyone. Hi. 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 Oh my gosh. Look at this amazing crowd. Welcome to the Writer's House and this amazing panel, Writing Food in Asian America. I'm Allie Katz, the program coordinator, and it is my amazing pleasure. I am so pleased to be here with all of you. And so before PIYALI launches into everything, I just wanted to make sure that we're thanking her for putting all of this together. PIYALI Bhattacharya is the Abrams Artist-in-Residence here at Penn. She teaches some extraordinarily popular classes, fictional friendship and writing Asian American lives. And these classes are so popular because she's so great, in case you were wondering. And she's such a fantastic teacher, mentor, and member of her community that she won the Beltran Family Award, for innovative teaching and mentoring at Kelly Writers House. And this award is presented to a member of the faculty who is a great teacher, yes, and a great mentor, yes, but also embodies the Writers House spirit of making learning everywhere, formally and informally. So PIYALI absolutely does that. So thank you to her for that during her whole time here at Penn. Another round of applause. We're going to applaud 3 times for PIYALI. Thank you also to the Beltrans who helped make that possible. So thank you to the Beltrans. And finally, just some points of order. We have books for sale. You may have seen them piled high with the books by our amazing panelists. We also will have a reception after this event because it's about food and also it's the Writer's House. And then we always have a reception. Final point, if you have a professor or member of the faculty who you love and you're a student here and you think embodies the Beltran Award spirit, let us know. Nominations are right now. So without any more ado, because I've been doing too much, PIYALI.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. Thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you to the Beltrans. Thank you to Kelly Writers House. Really, really thank you to Allie and Jessica for helping put this evening together. We've been working on this event for almost a year now, and that's what it takes to bring these 3 rock stars to Penn. And so I'm very, very grateful to them for coming. I'm very grateful to everybody who put in the work, including the samosas. So yeah, definitely buy books and come get your book signed afterwards, because I know these guys are excited to talk with you once we're done talking. So let me introduce you to them a little bit. So just going down the line here, Mayuk Sen is the author of Tastemakers, this extraordinary and beautiful book, subtitled 7 Immigrant Women Who Revolutionized Food in America. It was named a Best Book of 2021 by NPR, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, the list goes on, and it was nominated for the Brooklyn Public Library Book Prize. He's currently writing a biography of the actress Merle Oberon, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mayuk, but Merle Oberon was an actress, you guys might find this really interesting, but she was an actress who was of South Asian descent in the United States, but never claimed herself as such. She was white passing, yes?
Yes, that's correct. She was the first Asian actress ever nominated for the Best Actress Oscar prior to Michelle Yeoh this year, and thank goodness she won. Yet she concealed her South Asian identity throughout her lifetime and passed for white.
Yeah, so there's been much written about her as a historical figure, and Mayuk is sort of working on a book that sets the record straight a little bit. So we're very, very excited about that. But in the meantime, by the way, that's coming out in 2025 with Norton, but in the meantime, he has won a James Beard Award for his food writing, which is what we're going to talk to him about today, and he's been anthologized in 3 editions of the Best American Food Writing. He teaches creative writing at Columbia, and he lives in New York. I will also introduce to you Eric Kim, who wrote this gorgeous book, Korean American. Food That Tastes Like Home. It was an instant New York Times bestseller, which some of you might know. He's a former digital manager at the Food Network, contributing editor to Saveur magazine and senior editor for Food 52. He now hosts regular videos on New York Times' cooking YouTube channel. Some of us are very familiar with them. And he writes a monthly column for the New York Times Magazine. Eric has written for all the food things, Bon Appétit, Food and Wine, all of that. And also, of course, Best American Food Writing, and he also lives in New York. So Eric and Mayuk are our erstwhile nonfiction writers, and I get to also introduce Lillian Lee, who is the author of this gorgeous novel, #1 Chinese Restaurant, which came out in 2018 and was an NPR Best Book of 2018 and longlisted for the Women's Prize and the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize. Her work has also been published in the New York Times, Granta, One Story, also Bon Appétit, Travel and Leisure, Guardian, etc. Originally from DC area, she now lives in Ann Arbor. And so one of the focuses of our conversation today will hopefully be about what it means to write about food as Asian Americans, both from a nonfiction perspective, but also from a fiction perspective. You guys know me. I teach both fiction and nonfiction here at the Writers' House. I specifically teach a class called Writing Asian American Lives in the Fall, which tends to have a pretty serious food focus, whether we ever intend that or not. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted you guys to sort of be in the room today with these guys. I'm also working on a novel that is entirely set in a Bengali American restaurant, and so food is very much a part of my writing life, which is why I'm very excited to be in conversation with all of them. So I thought that instead of having them all read to you from their books, which you guys, I am encouraging you to go buy, I thought that actually what I want to use this time to do is actually spend the time talking to them and asking them about what they think about food writing. And so I just wanted to sort of open up the space with a question that I'm hoping each of them will take turns answering, which is just the very simple, what brought you to food writing, especially as an Asian American?
I am happy to start out. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. So I came to food writing by total accident. It was really financial circumstance and need that brought me to food writing. So I had grown up wanting to be a film critic. I devoured the works of Pauline Kael and David Thompson, for better or for worse. I read Entertainment Weekly a lot. I was obsessed with the Oscars, all that kind of stuff, right? So fast forward to me having graduated college, in 2015, I began a career as a freelance writer, writing about topics like film and television and music, basically every aspect of the culture except food, right? And so I was doing that for about a year and a half when an editor at a site called Food 52 reached out to me and said, hey, so, we're looking to hire a staff writer, someone who could write about culture through the prism of food, someone who is not necessarily a food person. And I was like, well, that sounds like me because I am neither an avid home cook nor a restaurant enthusiast. I know very little about food as an object. I can't write about it or talk about it with sophistication, but I need a job, I need a salary, I need benefits. This sounds great. And I think also what I didn't really account for back then is that I had always found food writing to be the domain of people who were very much unlike me, usually white, usually straight, rich, people who were comfortable or at ease in fine dining settings. And
felt smarter than us, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And I think it was if anyone's ever seen Mystic Pizza, there's that food critic at the very end who comes in. I was like, I think that kind of installed that vision in my head, right? But anyway, I always thought that food writing would always be out of bounds for me as a result of just who I was as a child of immigrants who, yes, I grew up comfortably middle class, but our conception of luxury was kind of limited to the Cheesecake Factory and P.F. Chang's. That's where we had celebratory dinners. And so I knew that I was kind of getting into some unworn territory by, starting my food writing career. But, here I am, 7 years later? So, yeah.
That's how that goes.
Yeah, exactly. Got
Yeah.
stuck.
What's really interesting is, first of all, I just noticed how our three books have share the same colors, which I think is really cool. And I also think that we shared the same clothes, the colors black and red today. It's pretty cool. Anyway, along that vein, I think I've said this before publicly, but I was at the Food Network first, but before that, I was a PhD candidate at Columbia. and I failed my oral exam. So I had to switch careers. And I took the first job I could get, which was at the Food Network. And I had some interest in food, but it was really at my desk in the cubicle of Chelsea Market where I was looking online and reading other people's works. And that's when I found food writing, and including Mayuk's work at Food 52. And I think it's kind of like interesting that, it makes sense that we're sitting next to each other. But what's really interesting for me is that I think finding someone who could write so academically and intellectually rigorously about food, that kind of appealed to me as a former academic and then someone who was maybe trying to find my next footing. And I'm okay telling this now because it's been so many years, but after he left, I got his job. They were looking for a senior staff writer. And then eventually I actually just so that's why this is all very connected. But I think we were talking about the job over the phone when we're talking about whatever. Basically, they were like, we actually need a senior editor more, so they gave me that role instead. But and they never hired his position again. And it was just one of those situations where that's at Food 52 is where I sort of started writing about food, and writing about my personal life as it ties to food was sort of the quickest thing I could do without reporting and doing research, because it was such a daily blog. And I think that site was known for blogging, but I think there was a piece that I wrote about coming out to my parents over kimchi fried rice. That was the first time I really felt the power of memoir. And I still think it's really interesting that I became a nonfiction writer, because I started out reading a lot of fiction. So I feel like sitting in the middle right here is perfect for me. And that's kind of how I started. And then everything from there, it really catapulted pretty quickly. And sometimes I still look up from my desk. I'm like, wow, I can't believe I'm here. So
That's awesome.
yeah.
So Mayuk, you actually stole my first line. I was going to say that it was a total accident as well that I fell into food writing. And for me, it was that I happened to work at a Chinese restaurant right before I went to grad school. And I wasn't intending to work at a Chinese restaurant. I actually wanted to work at an Applebee's. But because my family has, never worked at an Applebee's, I didn't realize that you get a restaurant job by going and asking to speak to the manager and maybe dropping off a resume. And so instead, my mother slipped a classified ad from the Chinese language newspaper under my door. And that is how I found my job. And actually, when I first got into the restaurant itself, I didn't realize that I wanted to write about it, because at the time I was working on some other idea that was very loftily about race dynamics, and very much about, a white family that runs into an Asian family, and it was very much about that dynamic. And it was only after I'd been in the restaurant for a couple of weeks that I realized that setting was so much more interesting to me, not because there was still this dynamic of the Chinese employees and the white customers, but rather because the customers became marginal in my experience as a waiter there. That really the world of the restaurant was behind the scenes, and that was where it was richest, and that was where actually whiteness wasn't really part of the equation at all. And so I became really interested in writing about just the restaurant family experience, and only through that did I realize what I think we've all been kind of circling around, which is that food is at the core of every other important topic in what it means to be human. It's so vital to not just our daily experience, but it ties us to our history, it ties us to our politics, it ties us to our family and culture. And so in some ways it's inescapable. I feel like at some point maybe all writing, if you boil it down, is food writing. I mean, that's probably too big of a generalization, but maybe one of you guys can take that as your senior paper.
Well, much of Asian American writing certainly tends to be linked to food, for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah. I love what you said about the behind-the-scenes world of the restaurant. Really is what becomes the main draw of restaurant life. That's really beautiful, and it's something I'm thinking about a lot these days. So I just want to engage with each of you in each of your works for a moment before we sort of get into it, sort of a larger conversation. So my first question is for Mayuk. And I was thinking, you write in your introduction that when you started working on this book, you wanted to sort of tell the story of immigration in America through the prism of food. And you spoke about this for a minute just now. You also say in the book, and the book, by the way, is really a profile of 7 different immigrant women in the U.S. Writing about food and writing about their food and writing about recipes. So it's a look at immigration in the United States. It's also a look at female chefs, and Mayuk's real focus in that was really to decanonize male food writing, which he's very explicit about in his introduction to his book. So I imagine that, the answer is obvious then, right? What are we looking for if this is the project? We're looking for immigrant female chefs, or immigrant female cooks even, is maybe how they would describe themselves, maybe not even. So I imagine that there are many obvious answers that you learned while studying from these women. One of the things that you write about is sort of how unapologetically sort of full they are, and how they never felt like they needed to sort of bend to anybody else's will. And maybe ironically, because they were pioneers, they kind of refused to water down their food writing in a way that a sort of flood of fusion eaters might have asked them to do in future moments, right? So given all of that, my question for you is then really a writing-based one, which is, what kind of language did you learn about from these women? Like, what was it in their food writing that was present then that maybe is less present now, or maybe just like what was in their presentation of food via language that was something that influenced your food language?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I would say something that stood out to me as I was, writing this group biography, as PIYALI just described, was that so many of these women, they really refuse to use essentialist language when talking about the foods of their countries of origin. And that is something that I struggled with a lot when I was coming into food writing, because when I began my food writing career, back in 2016, I, like Eric, I began writing a lot of memoiristic, pieces. I would ask myself, okay, well, you're this novice to food writing, so what does food mean to you? Look inside yourself, excavate every sort of story that lives inside you regarding food. So one example of a story along those lines was a piece about fruitcake, which is this, it's a slur both gastronomically and homophobically. Some people disregard fruitcake as this, just unwanted block of sodden, messy fruit. I don't know. And it's also a homophobic slur that I have been tagged with since childhood. And, what I challenged myself to do in that piece was to, talk about trace how these two meanings came to be, while also situating myself within these two meanings as a queer person of color, as, child of immigrants, yada, yada, right? But, I noticed when reading that piece back now, because I wrote it in 2016, there's so much language along the lines of, Bengalis like myself, Bengalis love fruitcake, and Bengalis do this, Bengalis do that. And those sort of broad brush statements can be so easily picked apart, because I can imagine so many readers who are of Bengali origin reading sentences like that and saying, that's not true. That does not necessarily jive with, my experience, my perspective. And, something that all 7 of these women did to some extent was, they refused to write about the foods of their homelands in that sort of way, or say all Chinese food is X or all Indian food is X. If anything, they really honored regional specificity and the true diversity of the ways in which the people within their countries actually ate and cooked. And it feels as though some food writing has maybe strayed from that in recent years. And so I hope that in reading my book, there will be, more people will be inspired by these women to return to that sort of specificity on the level of language.
I love the idea of specificity of language and also specificity of region, right? Like if we're talking about Asia, talk about specificity of region. I mean, nothing can be classified in Asia. I mean, not even along national lines. It's actually not possible. And this is the brainwashing, right? Like this is the full colonialism of the mind, where you said, these are all the thoughts I had right now as you were talking. You said fruitcake, both used as a slur in 2 different places, and my brain, the first sentence it went to was Bengalis love fruitcake. That's the first. It's the first. And then as you were talking, before you even got to the part where you were deconstructing your own sentence, I was like, Piali, stop. You know, like that. Like this is the work, right? This is the work that we're trying to do. Is like I recognize that like my first thought when Mayuk is talking is Bengalis love fruitcake. I'm also Bengali. My parents are Bengali. They love fruitcake. What are you talking about? Like, you know, like there's that impulse. I think what we're doing here today and what all of these people are doing in their work is pushing past that impulse, right? Is like trying really hard to acknowledge the impulse because it's going to come, and then try to dismantle it immediately or as quickly as we can, right? Which kind of brings me to Eric's work. So Eric, my question for you is that you open your book with this beautiful description of running away from home. And you follow it with this gorgeous meditation that I think a lot of us relate to about what it meant to run for a long time in order to find some version of ourselves that was divorceable from our parents, you know, especially children of immigrants. I mean, we grow up in very insular families, and it's very difficult to find ourselves outside of the very small family unit. And so for many of us, the journey of discovery has to take the form of leaving, at least for some time. And then the book takes a turn, and you write about what it means to find rootedness at home, which you refer to as Atlanta. But of course, for many of us, this is a very shaky definition of home. Our families have not been in Atlanta or New York or New Jersey or whatever it might be for centuries. They've been there for decades, maybe. But that's not necessarily part of the larger American narrative. And so our definition of home is often a tenuous one for other Americans. But our families are very much at home there. And, you know, Atlanta and the food you cook there with your mother tells such a powerful story of your home. And so I'm wondering two things. So, you know, especially as somebody who returned home, I think you mentioned in the book, in the pandemic, after having worked at the Food Network, which is this very specific, we all have a relationship with the Food Network, you know, we all grew up on it, we're all obsessed with it, and also we've all been really hurt by it, and we've all been really traumatized by it, and we've all been really traumatized by their language of exotic and spicy and ugly and, you know, random and oh my God, and I've never tasted this before, and, you know, like all of those languages. You sort of left, went to that space, and then came back to the home space. And therefore, I have a two-part question, which Mayuk also sort of like touched upon, which is that how did you encounter food language when you were first getting to know it, when you were first sort of working at Food 52 or Food Network or whatever it may have been? And then how did that language change for you when you went home and when you started working on this book?
Ooh, let's see. You know, I think even as soon as I started that project, it was right at the start of the pandemic, and Food 52 had laid me off. And so I was feeling a lot of feelings towards food media in general. And I think the one thing that I wanted to make sure was that I was writing about my own experience and centering it around the specificity of memoir. And in a way, memoir wasn't the route I was going to go. I was going to kind of try to do a reported situation where I traveled the country, but then, you know, we were all in lockdown, so I had to kind of change gears. And it was really comforting, to be honest, because memoir was the thing that I was always kind of good at and I knew how to do. But I didn't realize how much I could tap into the power of it until I moved back home. And moving back home, you know, this whole conception of home and homecoming or leaving, and it can all be very cheesy, especially when it comes to food writing. Like I don't know, a lot of food writing is very cheesy. And I do have a particular kind of allergy to it, but I think, you know, I'm sure some people think mine can be cheesy, but I think it's also very political. It's been even at a larger scale now at the New York Times, where the audience is way bigger. And whenever I write a piece, and it's the Korean pieces that stress me out the most. They're the worst because I want to do them. I really want to do them. I think they're important. But you get racist comments from the white readers, but you also get hate comments from the Koreans and the Korean Americans, because they're like, oh, my mom doesn't do it like that. That's not Korean. And I look at my text, I'm like, I really like never said that. And I do my best not to, because I've been so traumatized by that kind of reader response. Like, for instance, my very first piece for the New York Times was about these kind of like, I call them quick kimchis. And, my whole kind of perspective was regarding the Korean American experience, which is also very diverse. But so I was always very interested in the relationship between the United States and Korea. That's like sort of my thing. And even as an academic before, I was an Americanist. I studied 20th century American literature, fiction specifically. And I think the first thing that happened was, this is really specific, but it tells a story of like how pervasive this is. And
No, we want specific.
Okay, good. I mean, and how innocent I was to it, like how naive I was. But I wrote this piece, and the second it went up, I've always had this woman who like didn't like me, this Korean American journalist who's also a food writer. And this person emailed my editor right away with this long thing about like how incorrect it was and how I had misrepresented kimchi, and that I just like didn't know that the people who would be attacking me were my own people, and that was the most hurtful. It just really debilitated me, because I was like so excited for my first byline, my first moment with the New York Times. But what was really lovely was, again, I'm this like little battered puppy from the last job who they fired me, they laid me off. But then the new job, these women got on the phone with me. These white women got on the phone with me, and they were like, hey, let's talk this through. Like, are there actually any errors? Like, we're the New York Times, we have to like, if there's a correction that needs to be made, we need to make it. But we went through the piece really carefully, and there were no corrections to be made. It was it was factually correct. That was the first experience I had of what I would, have to deal with for the rest of my career. And so that book became sort of my anthem to like, it was my exploration of how I would address this kind of phenomenon of people who don't see themselves on the page, and then they finally do, and if it doesn't match their family's version, they get really upset. And I was like, okay, how do I put that into words? And even I had friends who are no longer my friends who didn't want me to call this Korean American because, they didn't want me to claim it. They didn't want me to claim it for myself. But I didn't write this book for myself. I really think that this book is saying that what's most important is for us to acknowledge that there's a multiplicity of experience, especially in the diaspora. And so, yeah, it's like right in the introduction. But I wanted to talk about running away from home because that was a way to physically address the first time I cooked non-Korean food. Woo, I'm like so tired. I think that's why I'm getting very emotional. Sorry, but I had like 2 hours of sleep the other day. Okay, so to finish the story, I got to the end of a year of cooking with my mother and realizing that wow, there's so many specificities and so much diversity within Korean American cooking, and the way to really address what I want to write about is to be as specific as possible and to talk about where my mother and I meet at the edges. Her Korean cooking, my American cooking. I call myself a Food Network baby. I wrote about it for the New York Times magazine. I think there's a generation of us who were latchkey kids because our parents were immigrants who worked. And I learned to cook from Rachel Ray and Emeril Lagasse. But it was one of those situations where, the story will sound like I'm aggrandizing myself, but like, there's that moment in Harry Potter 3 at the very end when he is waiting for his father to conjure the Patronus. Sorry, I'll try to translate this for the non-Harry Potter people. But there's a moment when he realizes that he's the one who has to do it, and so he steps up and he like conjures the Patronus. So I think I kind of had a moment like that where I was like waiting for a Korean person to write about Korean food for an American publication, and I was just like waiting for that kind of writing. And there were certainly predecessors, but not in the mainstream way that I had seen people like Rachel Ray or Emeril Lagasse on TV. So I was like, how do I do that? And when the New York Times kind of welcomed me with open arms, and they've really helped me and trained me to be as specific as possible in my memoir writing, but also my reporting. It's like this wonderful place where I get to, I think represent is a really dangerous word. I don't represent all Korean Americans or Koreans, but if I can write about gochujang in a way that's very specific and borrows from my academic learnings, and also like share delight, because that's really the point of the kitchen and cooking, then I think I'm like kind of doing my job, and I think so that's sort of where I landed, and I'm still figuring it out every day. But I think what's really important is that the people who don't like this book are the people who, you know, say that it's not Korean, and to that I say, well, that's because it's called Korean American. So
I really, really, really appreciate the idea that we are starting to take the burden of representation off of ourselves. I think that one of the things that's happening, and overwhelmingly, Asian America right now, as it is in 2023, I am venturing to guess that all four of us sitting up here right now, our parents were the immigrants. So we are really first-generation Americans. We're the first generation of first-generation Asian Americans that are starting to mature in this country, and the burden of representation for everything we do is so exhausting, and that's where the real pain comes, because you don't know that the people who are going to attack you the hardest are your own people. Like, you really don't know that that's what's going to be the case. And writers in the room, get ready, because that's coming. But that it's really it's something that I'd actually like to pause on for just a second, and ask Mayuk and Lillian if you guys have had moments with that, just because it is such a hit when it comes that, like, at least I wasn't prepared for how much the people I would have to defend my work against the most was actually Asian Americans. Like that. I'm wondering if you could speak to that for a second.
I think because mine was set within a Chinese restaurant, there was, and I think this is also maybe an aspect of class that came through that ended up inadvertently sheltering me, which is that not that many people that were reading my books were necessarily actively working within a Chinese restaurant. And a question that I got a lot whenever I speak about the book is, have the people at your restaurant read your book? And the thing is that the conditions in which I was working in the restaurant, everyone's working, there's just no time to even be with your family, let alone leisure reading in a language that is not your most comfortable language. And so I think there was an aspect of, I was incredibly afraid before the book came out, and I talked to a lot of people who had already published books that were speaking about a story that hadn't been told before. And I ended up creating a lot of additional anxiety for myself, that when it didn't come to fruition, I actually then just had to continue looking into the mirror and in some ways holding myself to a kind of standard and realizing, oh, I didn't do as much research into Chinese restaurants. And now when I talk about it, I need to be bringing up the history of Chinese restaurants and why they proliferated in America, because they were the only profession that Chinese male immigrants were allowed to have, because it was considered women's work. They were forced out of every other kind of labor force, so laundries and restaurants were the only things available to them. So all these things I didn't know going ahead of time, and I think maybe that's the other edge, and in some ways maybe Eric, you were speaking to that too, this additional standard, while it can be a really punishing yardstick for yourself, maybe one day what it will end up accomplishing is actually just a higher standard for everyone to hold themselves to when writing about a story that is not completely one's own, but also just when you're interrogating yourself. We all have our blind spots even with our own stories. So maybe that's another way that anxiety can end up being not the worst thing to put yourself through.
Well, certainly as a writer, anxiety plays a role no matter what.
Totally. I was just going to add that, I also try to dodge that sort of pushback from within my own community by just moving away from memoiristic work. In those first few months of being like a know-nothing food writer at Food 52, I was like writing my essays about fruitcake and everything like that. And then after a few months, I was like, wow, I'm so bored with writing about myself. I'm such an uninteresting character. I was more compelled by the stories of other people, and turning my narrative gaze outward, I think helped, deflect a lot of that potential pushback. But it's interesting. This is kind of outside the scope of this conversation, so I'll keep it brief. But I'm seeing that pushback now with this book that I'm writing that PIYALI mentioned at the top of our conversation. It's a biography of this actress, Merle Oberon, who, as PIYALI mentioned, concealed her South Asian identity in public and passed for white. And I've gotten so many responses from within the Bengali American community, from the South Asian diaspora more generally, that were along the lines of, why are you even writing this book at all? Why would you glorify someone who hated herself, and so on and so forth? And that elides so many complications about the way that we might relate to our racial identities, or elides the complications of her life as well. And so I'm bracing myself, after a few years of just kind of, not getting too much heat from my people, at least that I saw. So
we'll get there. Lillian, I'm so glad that you mentioned that one of the big questions that you got asked was, did people from the restaurant you worked at read your book? Because it gives me the opportunity to talk about the difference between fiction and nonfiction, which is something that people do not seem to grasp at all. You wrote a novel. It is a work of fiction. You may also have worked at a Chinese restaurant. The two actually don't have much to do with each other necessarily. Like one may have inspired the other, but one of the things that I really hope we are instilling here at Penn in our students and our fiction students is the urge to resist asking fiction writers how much of their fiction is actually nonfiction, right? Like that's a big one. And I think that for me, the thing that was most compelling about your very beautiful novel, Lillian's novel, is set in, as she mentioned, in a Chinese American restaurant at a moment in which the son of the family that owns the restaurant is wanting to take over the restaurant from the parents' generation. And it's a very specific multi-generational story about how immigrant food changes when it changes hands, even within a multi-generational mixed American family, right? And so my question really for you is that I'm particularly obsessed with this sort of idea that the younger generation in your book has a very different idea of food and how it should be presented to an American audience, they being American themselves, than the older generation does, they being immigrants, obviously. And they've, the immigrant generation had to, as you mentioned, rely on certain tropes in order to be able to sell this food. Their children's generation, which is a gap that is a huger leap than most parents and children usually have to make. That generation has a very different idea about how to sell Chinese food in the United States. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the difference specifically in the language around food that each of these generations uses, and about how maybe it influenced your own food writing.
Yeah, that's such a great question. Thank you for that. And I think it ties back a little bit with what you were saying and how the Food Network has wounded us all in the way that it has described food as exotic or foreign. And I think that what is really interesting about Chinese restaurants to me is that there are more Chinese restaurants in America than Burger King's, McDonald's, Taco Bell's, Pizza Hut's combined. Wow. It is, there is a Chinese restaurant in the smallest town in America. It is, in some ways, one of the most amazing entrepreneurial stories that we have in America, and it's not one that is framed in that way. And I think that, in part, there is what we now might think of as complicitness with the generation that was doing the popularizing of Chinese American cuisine in order to make a living and even to thrive in America and set up the next generation with even more success, where they saw the fascination that people had with Chinese food or Chinese American food. They understood that certain palates, for example, apparently white Americans love broccoli. So broccoli is not a big part of Chinese cooking, but now you go to any Chinese restaurant, it's the garnish for everything. Yeah. And so just understanding, this is the palate of the people who are going to be spending money. So, okay, why not make it so that the people will spend even more money? There was maybe more of a clear and direct relationship between the food and then the business side of things. And then I think how that gets colored by the next generation is the next generation is given maybe a step ahead, but that angle and that perspective it skews their ability to see what their parents were coming up against. And so where in fact it was enterprising and entrepreneurial, what they see instead is, bowing down to popular tastes and, belittling oneself, demeaning the cuisine. And so the way that Jimmy, who is the son that takes over for his family, restaurant, sees the restaurant that in some ways allowed for him to even dream of a bigger restaurant in DC, where there's suddenly, food that could be considered like Michelin star quality, that everything that laid the path for him is what he is now belittling, that he couldn't even get to this place of having that perspective without actually really being grateful to what came before him. And I guess on some meta level, I think I was also grappling with my own brattiness when I was coming into my own writing, where I would think about the Chinese American writers before me, and I would think about the specific language that they were using at the time, the specific stories that they were telling at the time, and I would think, oh man, I would never write something like that, instead of realizing that they were building a room for me that I could now add an extension onto, and without them, there would be no house. And so I think there was a lot of growing up that I had to do in writing this book, and I think a lot of growing up for the characters as a result.
Yeah, I'm so grateful you said that about the the writers who came before us who built the house so that we can build the second floor. Like that's been such a part of my education, not just on food writing, but also on food, which has been like, I don't know, you grow up in an immigrant household, every Indian restaurant you go to is not good enough, right? Like that's, and I think that the thing that I really had to come to terms with is that like there is a difference between Indian food and Indian American food. And Indian American food is its own authentic thing, which is why, Eric, I was so excited about the name of your book, right? Like it is its own thing. And there is no point in saying that it is not authentic Chinese food because it uses broccoli. No kidding. It's Chinese American food. There's a reason, like that is authentic Chinese American food. And maybe we need to write about it as such, and that's something that's sort of just like been in the back of my mind. So I want to steer our conversation in the direction of writing about food in fiction versus nonfiction, which is partly why I was hoping that our panel would be split evenly between the two genres. I'll say for myself that I think that the magic of fiction is also the incredibly frustrating thing about fiction. I find that as a fiction writer, I feel very limited in what I can explain to the reader about anything, about plot, about sentimentality, but really, and this is true for me in a way that it's not true for white fiction writers, about culture and specificity, right? There's not much that I am given room to explain, and yet I have to write in a way where the reader is obviously carrying on with the story without feeling preached to, right? In my idealistic mind, I believe that nonfiction allows for more explanation than fiction does, but when it comes down to it, I don't actually think it does. But Eric, you used the word mainstream in your work with the New York Times. I'm just wondering if we can think through what it means to write mainstream, to write without too much explanation, but also to write with explanation, because sometimes our stuff requires explanation. And I find myself like in the weeds of these conversations. So I put it to you guys.
This is top of mind for me because I just put out a piece about gochujang, and it was an idea, and it was an idea by my Chinese American editor, Genevieve Ko. And she and I are constantly thinking about how to use the platform of New York Times Cooking to teach people, not just about different cuisines, but also had just like empathy. Because I think,
yes, please teach
I think that's something that really is lacking in the world. But also just when it comes to food, we're always thinking about the details of how much information to give, and because a recipe, even though it is digital, most of New York Times Cooking is digital. We do have a print paper, obviously, but I think you're thinking about how to quickly relay information because you're literally in the reader's in the kitchen having to follow the recipe. So if you explain too much of why you want to stir a certain way so that the garlic doesn't burn. By the time you finish that sentence, the garlic will be burned. So it was just really cool I just put out a gochujang buttered noodle dish, and it's like one of the simplest recipes I've ever written, but on the other hand, it was also one of the most difficult because, for a whole week, it took me months to get it right, first of all, across like multiple homes too. It was like over the holiday, and it was many months. But then I also watched her on her like vacation go into the doc and like delete certain words, like certain commas. Like she was really thinking hard about how to optimize this to be as informative as possible. It was really satisfying when it did go up, watching all these people cook it, but also today I finally got one comment that was like, "What is gochujang?" And it's one of those things where I'm glad we didn't define it in the recipe. I mean, I wrote a whole piece about it. There's a whole column that the person can click the link, but it felt like it showed me how far we've come, because she and I have been working together for the last couple of years to teach people what gochujang is. I've had many recipes with gochujang. We do it very deliberately. On the other hand, I hope I'm not like going too far away, but like I prefer tenjang. Tenjang is a fermented soybean paste, and I think it's really magical and more versatile and more like funkier, kind of like Parmesan. See, like the thing I just said, that's information that you would give in a nonfiction
and
piece.
that's the instinct.
Yeah, that's the instinct. But I developed all these like really cool tenjang recipes, thinking that we could help make it become a thing. Like my fantasy is to have an entry in the Merriam-Webster dictionary that's where tenjang. I love tracking when Korean words are added to the English dictionary, not because I think that it legitimizes them, but because it shows how prevalent it's become in culture, and dictionaries follow culture. And then you get a little example and it says your name. So I'm like trying to anyway, so beyond the selfishness of it, I just realized how far we have to come though, because none of those recipes hit. No one really cared about tenjang. It's hard to say, it's hard to spell. I'm working on it, but the gochujang piece made me realize, wow, like we still had to go back to gochujang. We still had, like, people still don't know what that is. People still don't know how to use it. That I realized working with her especially that the value of service journalism. It's not just to teach people information and it's nonfiction that provides service, but it's also nonfiction that provides it teaches and it helps people to understand a cuisine, to go to that grocery store, to pick out that ingredient, and to think outside of their own minds. And that's something that I'm always trying to do with my recipes.
That's really the rub of it, though, right? Is like this idea that, like, on the one hand, like, even again, while you were telling the story, I was like, yes, now we will all use tenjang, and then at the end you were like, no, that still no, like that. And I like this is really where I sort of hit up against the word mainstream, right? Because on the one hand, in 2023, yes, there is a readership of the New York Times that knows what gochujang is, that can do that recipe and be interested in it, and doesn't even have to click the link for the explanation. And so therefore we have taught somebody something, and we are making a path forward, and yay DEI, right? And like, but the truth is that, like, actually, if you really want to get into it, nobody knows what tenjang is, and more importantly, they don't care, like that. Even if you're telling them, they don't care. And so that's where I'm just like hitting up against this exhaustion, where I just feel like, okay, we've come this far, but like every time we try to take a step further, we're like, no, we're still in gochujang territory. Like we're barely in gochujang territory. Like I don't know what you guys think.
Okay, this is gonna like be word salad here, so just brace yourselves. I just, in kind of hearing these responses, I think back to something that I would tell a lot of my food writing students over the past few years, as I've been teaching food writing on the university level, which is avoid imprecise analogies. We just heard Parmesan, for example. Another one is like saying that, dosa is an Indian crepe, and it's like, is it? That requires more qualifications than really, explaining a ton. And if anything, avoiding that sort of imprecision will lead us to be more imaginative with our language, and so why don't we just try to explain what dosa is to someone who might not be from South Asia in a way that does not necessarily just, rely or presuppose this sort of not presuppose, reinforce this hierarchy in which Western European cuisine, reigns supreme over all others, especially those of the global South. But, I think generally I would say, I've been grappling with a lot of these questions as I've been, writing nonfiction, food writing over the past few years. And, especially as I was writing my book, I was thinking about, okay, well, whom are you writing this book for? Who's your audience? The classic writer's question, right? And it was really, two-pronged. Whenever I was writing about, say, Jamaican food in the chapter on Norma Shirley, who's the Jamaican-born chef I profiled in my book, I was asking myself, would someone who is from Jamaica or, Jamaican origin living in the diaspora, would they, find that this, explanation of their food is true to their experience, or is it a broad brush statement, and so on and so forth. So I'd ask myself, what is someone within the community, how would they react to this, and I'd also try and empathize in the sense I'd be like, okay, well, if someone were to make this sort of statement about Bengali food, would you be rankled by it in some way? But in addition to that, I was also thinking of my mother, and I was like, I want to write a book that my mother can understand, because I was reared in a time in food media when the presupposed reader was oftentimes a white woman in Wisconsin, who loved the Pioneer Woman and, devoured the Food Network. And it was, this sort of pressure to genuflect to their tastes and their sensibilities and tiptoe around those sensibilities, not offend them as much as possible. But I kind of inverted that as I was writing my book. And I said, okay, well, what about your mother, Mayuk? She's someone who did not grow up speaking English. Would she be able to understand what you are writing about? Are you over explaining things for her? Are you giving her enough information to be invested in this woman's story? And without, losing sight of the main character in each of these profiles. So I was thinking of many readers that I was writing.
Are you giving your mother enough information as you're writing? I think it's a great question for us, right? Like, it's actually it's kind of a good North Star question for us in terms of we're so obsessed with our white reader, but what about our mom as a reader? It's a nice question for us. I want to give students a chance to ask some questions. So I know there's going to be at least a couple. So go for it, guys. I think there's a mic that's going to go around. Yes? Yes. Madeline has a mic for you. Anyone? Yeah. Oh, wait, Madeline, did you yourself have a question? Oh, yes. Go for it, Madeline.
I was wondering, when so much of popular food, especially YouTube, has to do with creating a persona, or in a more generous sense, having a viewership, or having a base, or that's what it seems like with internet personalities that people latch onto. How do you navigate, or how do you navigate having a personal life, especially on social media, and then having to parse or think about what your personality is going to be, in a sense, to when part of it seems like a food personality's work is about having that sort of likability base. Is that difficult? What is that experience like, especially when you might not look like all of your viewership? Not sure what my question is specifically, but what's your experience with that been like?
I'm guessing it's from me, maybe. But I think, I just read a mean comment today on my latest video. It was like,
do you read all the mean comments?
Yeah, I'm kind of a masochist. But this comment was like, mocking. It was like, in my voice. Oh yeah, look, Mom, I'm on the New York Times YouTube channel, and I decided to wear a wrinkled shirt, and I don't tuck it. I tuck in my shirts without wearing belts. But but what's really funny is what's really funny is I don't think people realize that that's such a sliver of my job. I'm barely stumbling out of bed those mornings. I had to write a recipe. I had to test it. I had to write the whole column for that. I had to, prepare for stuff. And the way I look is the last thing I have time for those videos. So I think I'm really lucky because I work with a team that acknowledges that, I kind of started in the beginning with them. We all got together and we were like, okay, let's kind of create a YouTube presence for the New York Times cooking. And in those early videos, my videos didn't do as well as my white counterparts. And I think what's really lovely is over time it grew. And I think the producers, like they all understood that they weren't trying to. I mean, we learned a lot from Bon Appétit's mistakes, but I also I think one thing that was really true is that you just have to keep presenting that person. You have to like keep showing them, putting them in front of people, and over time my videos started doing better, and because it's like a familiar face that you see once in a while, and so I guess what I want to say is that I think I just like don't have time to think about that. But I'm very lucky that I don't have to think about it. I have other people thinking about it for me. I just have to be myself, and I just have to cook the things that I've worked on. And I think I'm just lucky that it worked out. But it is true that there is this pressure, and I think when people are trying to start in an industry like this, there is that. I think you are spot on with your question. There is that that element to it, but I think I'm. Yeah, I don't know if that answers it, but there's an element there of, at least in our videos, it's just very real because I'm talking to my colleagues in the room, my friends. The camera is like not really something I'm thinking about, and I think it comes from a group of people who are just trying to do good work, and that's like advice I try to give everyone in all mediums, like just. Do your work. Yeah. I think you said that to me once. Mike said that to me once. He was like, "Stop reading, Twitter comments and stop going." So he was like, "Just do your work." You said, "Just do your work," and I was like, oh, "Okay." I did my work, and then, like 2 years later, I got a nice job, and then I have a book out, and it all just kind of happens when you focus and do the work.
You focus and do the work, and also like one of the things about social media that social media specifically shares with writing is that both of them are built on a rock solid foundation of rejection. Like, that is what writing is about. 100% is just about brutal, personalized, ad hominem attack rejection. Like, that is what writing is. Don't let anybody tell you that writing is anything other than that. So really, the only advice then, whether it's social media or writing, is just to put your head down and do the work, right? Like, if you believe in the work, that's the only thing. That's the only reason why we're here, right? Like, Angela had a question up here.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. This is really informative. I guess my question, I'm specifically interested in hearing about cookbooks themselves, but also like if the rest of you have things to say. I guess I'm interested in sort of how like food writing came from like oral storytelling, because like my parents don't own cookbooks, and I feel like I learned to cook by just them telling me what to do, rather than like we also don't even really own measuring cups. You just kind of
and they're terrible arbiters of telling you what to do, like
by feel. So I'm curious how for you all, like in your language, do you how you pay respect to sort of this tradition of food writing as oral storytelling, or if you even see the two as related at all.
The only reason I'll answer is to just say that South Asian food is extraordinarily labor intensive, right? And so, as is many types of Asian cuisine. And so, there is no way to enter it without storytelling. There is no way to enter a South Asian recipe, at least from me, without entering it via story. Because if I enter it via list of instructions, I'll die. So like it's too many instructions. I don't know. I don't know if that's true for you guys.
I mean, technically, I can speak to that part. I would cook with my mom a dish that we've had our whole lives, and she would write it down with her measurements. I would watch her do it. We would eat it, and it wouldn't taste like the thing. That's what happens. So recipe writing is something that I've become very interested in intellectually, because it's just not like a one-to-one. And so my job with especially writing that book was from the bat defining this thing called sonmat, which is like hand taste. And the point is like, I will never get my food close to, like, I will never get my food to match exactly the way my mother did it. Even she can't do that like when she's trying to write down her own recipes. And I have a guacamole that I was trying to do, and it didn't taste right until I left room in the instructions and the ingredients list for it to like actually come out the way it's supposed to. So I think my point is that technically the way you write the recipe, it needs to leave room for the cook to like taste and to have some instincts. And if not, my job is also to like help teach people to develop instincts over time. And it's really hard to do, but I think that's like the main, I like your question because I know what you mean and something I've been thinking about a lot, but it's really important when you are writing a cookbook to describe the moments in the dish where the cook has to like make it happen. Like AI can't do that. You know?
I'll just share a quick story about my grandmother, which is that when I was hanging out with her and she was starting to make some food for me, she was like, I need to teach you how to cook. And I was like, Grandma, I know how to cook. And she's like, no, you read recipes. That's not cooking. But I think what Eric is saying about teaching people to have confidence and instincts in their own way of cooking rather than necessarily feeling that cooking is some kind of rule book that you have to follow. I feel like that's been the hardest lesson for anyone entering cooking to learn. Just have a lot of friends and family members who don't cook for themselves, and there's such a rigor to like, it has to be exactly this. And it's when you let go, and I think you let go of that idea of perfection, that I think it starts to really feel like cooking.
Yeah. There was another question up here, I think. Yeah.
My question is around, so I grew up Korean American. My parents immigrated here, and when I was growing up, kimchi was not cool. You know, like my like people would walk into the house and like comment about the smell and how it smells funny, and then they would open the fridge and like laugh at the stuff that was inside because it looked so foreign. And now there's been this great turn of events where kimchi is cool, and like Korea is kind of this like epicenter in some ways. And so sometimes when the other day I saw this white TikTok guy who is like making I don't know, he's probably making a killing, but he has this massive following and he's just doing like Korean recipe, like kimchi and all this sorts of stuff.
Logan food?
I don't remember. Yeah, yes, that's right. And I guess the question is it, you know, the more the merrier, and, you know, the more we can just get out there. Is it like a win situation for someone like me or someone, you know, for any of us who are minorities, and you have like a non-Korean or fill-in-the-blank person cooking those recipes and sharing it, or is it like appropriation? And how do you think about that?
Oh man, that's a heavy one. What do you think, Mayuk?
Yeah, I haven't like been talking at all. I'm usually very cynical about this stuff, but I would say that I'd err on the side of it being a win, maybe because, you know, it's not terrible. For example, when I think about, you know, my people's food, you know, I don't think it's horrendous that, you know, there are some South Asian condiments available in Trader Joe's, for example, even if they, you know, are not as good as what one could get in like Sabji Mandi or Patel Brothers or something like that. You know, it's a start, and, you know, we all have to begin somewhere. But, you know, regarding the sort of dynamic that you were pointing to with, you know, certain creators, usually white, or usually ones who do not belong to the group whose food they are representing, you know, sometimes rising to fame in a way that might obscure, you know, figures from those communities, you know, having that same level of prominence. You know, that is something that I noticed just in writing my book, you know, played out so often throughout history, you know. For example, in my book, I devote a chapter to Elena Zellieta, who was born in Mexico, and she was considered the preeminent author on Mexican cooking for Americans until a white British woman named Diana Kennedy came along and, you know, usurped, you know, that position. And, you know, Diana Kennedy, despite not having ancestral ties to Mexico, became the go-to source on Mexican cooking. And I posit in my book that, you know, that has a lot to do with the fact that many Americans may have seen someone like Diana Kennedy as this impartial observer, you know, someone who is able to write about Mexican cooking and Mexican foodways from a dispassionate remove that allowed readers in America to better connect with her rather than someone like Elena Zellayeta. And, we're seeing this play out again and again. I won't name names, but, there were certain personalities, 3 years ago or so who got, quite a bit of flack for, their chickpea stew, which, resembled a curry and stuff like that. And, I think that it's a productive use of our collective energies to maybe not focus our critiques on individuals who are symptomatic of just a larger systematic problem. It's really the systems that are broken. I don't quite know how to fix that apart from, making sure that people like Eric, for example, have opportunities on stages like the New York Times to, rise at the same level as a lot of those other folks.
Lillian said something earlier, which is that, Lillian, you said that like food writing, you came to it partially because it's so political. And I have to say that that's true for me too. Like, I came to food writing via its politics, via its immigration politics, via its race politics, via its gender politics. Food writing for me was not something that I came to because I absolutely loved testing recipes. Food writing is something I came to because I wanted to write about undocumented immigrants. And where are undocumented Asian immigrants in this country? They are in food spaces. Like that is something that that led me to food writing. And I think that I'll elide the more specifics of your question, but I will say that like the politics of food is extraordinarily important. And I think where the Food Network has failed us is when they haven't concentrated on how political the food they're talking about actually is. The food they're talking about, it not only crosses national boundaries, like there are regional boundaries within the nations that it crosses, and there are regional, Mayuk was talking earlier about Bengali food. I was like, well, East Bengal or West Bengal, like depends which one, right? Like that's a big question in my mind. Every time somebody says Bengali food, I'm like, which Bengal, Like that level of specificity. We were all talking earlier about specificity. Mayuki, we were talking earlier about specificity of language and eliding sort of inane redundancies in your writing. I can only come to these questions with specificity, right? I can only come to these questions with extraordinary detail and extraordinary precision on what it is that I'm saying, and being extremely aware of the histories of what it is that I'm talking about. Because if I'm not well versed in the histories of what I'm talking about, like whoever this person is that is making TikTok videos about Korean food, maybe they're making good videos, but really my question for them is, do you know the history? Like what is the actual history of this dish? Do you know the full regional, linguistic, political, geopolitical, socioeconomic history of this dish? Because I guarantee you it has all of those things. Like if you can't answer all of those questions about this dish, it doesn't really matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you're Korean American. Maybe you shouldn't be making this video until you can answer all those questions, Last question.
After.
Sorry. last question. Student.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your stories. I'm Magnolia, and I just want to say, Eric, I've fallen in love with your writing ever since you've written that piece dedicating the chocolate cake to Lizzie, the ASMR queen. And I love it so much so that I actually dedicated one of my senior creative projects emulating off of that piece. Is TMI. It's about like a recent breakup, but I found myself like writing about it because this is something that we baked a lot together, and it brought like both catharsis, but also it kind of like tore open like raw emotions, and I actually really wanted to get into that in my writing, so I found myself having to bake like the tiramisu again. And I'm just wondering, like, when you go between like cooking or baking and writing, do you feel more like when you're actually doing the cooking or writing, and do you feel more catharsis or more like raw emotions? I know, like you mentioned, like your family's gochujang, like that, like bringing the old gochujang, like that sparks some emotion in you, and I'd be happy to hear from others as well.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks for mentioning that piece. That was a piece dedicated to a friend who died of pancreatic cancer, and it's something that I'd wanted to write for a long time. It was actually cut out of a Food 52 piece because that editor thought it wasn't like relevant, and So it was sort of like me, like a few years later, doing it justice in the New York Times Magazine, and yes, I think I'm in the middle of writing a memoir, like just a collection of essays, and there are things that I've put aside for many, many years, like a decade, because they're about a lot of traumas. But I think I don't know. I was talking to someone earlier about how writing is a way to kind of work through those traumas, and I used to think I could just like not think about those things ever again, but I found that with age and time, writing about them from a distance really helps me. And this also answers the other question about social media. What I put on social media is usually a few days later. It's like I need it, when you distance yourself from the thing, it's easier to share, and that's how you know you're ready to share it.
Well, I want to give all of us some time to get some books, get some food, get some books signed, ask our panelists some more questions. But in the meantime, thank you guys so much for being here. Really, a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. Go get some books and go get some samosas.